It's great to be here with you today, Ete, to talk about a topic that I know we're both very passionate about, social mobility. And before we start, Ete, it would be great for the audience and for those that are watching this after, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your role and your career.
Yeah, sure. So CEO of Engine's creative division. Engine is the UK's largest advertising, communications and business transformation consultancy. And I run the creative division that I run ostensibly does advertising, digital marketing, social media marketing. It's actually my 1 year anniversary this week. Very strange year to start a new job. Yes. Prior to, I've been in the industry for over about 17 years, just over 17 years, mainly working agency side, like digital agencies, but also some integrated agencies. Originally started out as a project manager and then pursued my career from leading and sort of helping teams work towards complex solutions for clients to building cultures and environments that are inclusive that help clients solve problems when I moved into leadership roles. Outside of, I guess, my professional work as CEO, I'm also the co-founder of We Are Stripes and Culture Heroes. And they are two D&I, diversity and inclusion initiatives centered on Black, Asian and multi-ethnic talent in the creative industries and creating opportunities for them, both access and entry, but also with progression to leadership. I'm also active on a lot of advisory boards for other diversity and inclusion initiatives, Creative Equals amongst them, and Hey Big Man.
Oh, I just lost that.
Oh, did you lose the last part? Yeah, sorry. I was just saying that I work at D&I initiatives, so We Are Stripes and Culture Heroes, which is focused on BAME talent in the creative industries, and then I support on advisory boards and a non-exec director on a range of other D&I initiatives.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Ete. And you are very modest about all the additional work that you do to your very, very busy day job. And I know we've had some previous conversations, particularly about the impact of the pandemic on inequalities in the UK and globally, and it's what we want to talk about today. Before we start, my first question really is to ask you if you could help define social mobility in terms of what's your definition of social mobility, and in addition to that, what do you see as the key barriers for people that are in poverty or lower social economic status moving up?
Yeah, it's very it's a good question, that definition around social mobility, because it is very complex, both within the UK, but when you look at things globally. And sometimes I find the prevalent definition a little bit problematic, social mobility being movement of individuals and families or households to different social strata in society. And the reason I personally find that problematic is that it sort of comes from a school of thought or an era of a school of thought, when in the UK, for example, whilst there was quite a clear class system, certain minorities weren't even considered within that class system. And it's a very Western-centric definition of social mobility based on values, capitalism, and so on, which doesn't necessarily apply globally. And so whilst I think that definition is broadly applicable, I do fear it's probably a little bit anachronistic for the progressive, modern and intersectional, diverse world we find ourselves in. But from a personal point of view, I've always viewed social mobility in its most simplest sense as having the resources, opportunity and empowerment to improve your overall quality of life as you see fit as an individual, or as much as you can, really. And so it's relative, of course, but it's having those things, resources, opportunity and empowerment to change your quality of life to a standard that you feel suits you, or that you aspire to. And that centers so much on economic levers, really, and the resources part predominantly is around, I guess, support that you have of government and infrastructure, but also income that allows you, particularly in the UK, that allows you to change things around your quality of life or sort of improve them. And so the primary barriers I see, again, talking from a UK point of view, for me, the two standout ones are education, or access to sort of self-development, which is very much tied to and propagates access to work and career opportunities, because they really drive your sort of economic output and potential, really, which is one of the big ways you can improve your social mobility or social condition in the UK. There are obviously other areas and kind of barriers as well, such as safety and security in communities, health, housing. Those are all, I would say, associated barriers. But the primary ones for me, I think, it's all about education and the ability to develop skills that are relevant to help you to progress, and also then access to work and career opportunities and equitable payment as well.
No, absolutely. And that point in terms of the definition, first of all, it's, as you say, it's a very Western view, and it also it's part, in my view, it's part of the problem. And it's really interesting looking at this when you look at a global level as well, is when you start to define success, or as you put it, overall quality of life. We're doing a similar piece of work in India, and actually a lot of the measures of overall quality of life are not just about economic success, economic status. And again, that isn't, in my view, just relevant to Asian cultures. We should be measuring our success and our quality as much on the relationships that we're forming, our mental well-being, our access to healthcare, and other things. And I think some of the research that's been done in this area often looks at single variables that tell us a little, but they really don't tell us enough. I mean, one of the measures in the UK is often whether a child has received free school meals or not, in terms of a measure of their previous economic status, and looking at their salary in later life. And yes, that will show us something, but it's not going to show us the whole story. And it's not till we start to understand the whole story, as you're saying, how do we then understand how we start to reduce those barriers, and most importantly, increase those opportunities to a wider proportion of the population in the UK.
Agreed.
And I think absolutely the core barriers are access to education, and in that, therefore, access to work, because the decisions that we all make during our education years impact then our ability to make decisions around or receive a certain salary and an equitable salary as well. And there's lots of complexity around that we'll come on to throughout this conversation. We know that the last six months, and we were talking about it a little bit before this session, has meant that has had a disproportionate impact to those people at a lower social economic status, those that were in poverty, and it's made inequalities further in the last 6 months. What, in kind of your view, Ete, has what impact has this had on companies or society as a whole on starting to actually achieve better social mobility, and specifically because the series we're particularly talking around kind of gender equality, and even when we're looking at inequalities around ethnic groups, often they're disproportionately impacting on women more than men. How do you think that the last 6 months has played out, and what impact do you think that it's had on those two topics?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a very, very challenging time, and I can speak quite specifically towards obviously the UK and the advertising creative sector, but I'm sure it's reflective of a lot of sectors and situations globally, and across the sector, with the quite dramatic impact of revenues. It's forced a lot of businesses immediately to look at costs, either to sustain operating or to protect margins. And the most demonstrable thing of that has been businesses making redundancies and furloughs. I think the Creative Industries Federation did some recent research, and they found that we were looking in terms of the economic outlook for creative industries, about £74 billion turnover loss compared to last year. And so that, that's around 30%. Now you can imagine that 30% drop, what that suddenly makes a business decide it has to do in terms of its costs and its services, which, particularly in the creative industries, is always people, and how they can get more efficiency, so to speak, out of people. And so that same study is also, I think, identified like around 120,000 drop in employment amongst employees across the sector, and around 200,000 job losses or thereabouts. Quite a few in London and the southeast, but all across the country, even despite the coronavirus job retention scheme. So with that focus on companies trying to save costs to keep operating, really, to a certain extent, many across the sector, I imagine, have sort of put on pause or had to reevaluate the plans and the measures they were taking towards things like hiring, promotions, progression, worse yet, like pay gaps. All of these things that would have addressed the inequality and inequities in the structure of their people, their chances for progression, their chances, their systems for compensation, which would, just exacerbate, really, the current gender inequality we have in things like pay, in representation, in senior leadership, because everything has been, either paused or deprioritized under the view of cost management. It's not been helped a great deal in the UK by, the government giving a bit of a buy to companies having to report on their gender pay gaps until 2021, alongside a requirement to report an ethnicity gap. And the challenge for that, which I'll speak about in a second, is that the makeup of those organizations might unfortunately be quite dramatically different by the time they next do that report. And so we risk going into a cycle where not only do we have less women and minorities potentially in the sector, but actually, because of the result of that representation, the pay gap is extended even further, and a lot of the good work has been undone. Women and minorities, there are lots of studies that have shown, and I think Creative Equals and did one recently that showed that women and minority groups, they're reporting higher levels of things like psychological stress and unfair treatment at work. And there is a lot of fear they have, and a lot less confidence about the long-term stability of their job compared to potentially male talent when it comes to women, because again, lots of studies have found that the unfortunate thing about the pandemic is that women have still had to deal with a disproportionate amount of the childcare. I think there was a TUC study that said 2 in 5 women, even now and in recovery, don't have childcare that means that they can return to work full time. And companies faced with challenges around their commercials may not be able to support part-time. It's sort of trying to maximize hours and maximize utilization, and so then it puts those, minority groups in a very vulnerable position around the security of their jobs, really. And that, that's all coming through in the research data again, as Creative Equals have shared, and others around women and minority groups feeling less secure. We are seeing higher percentages and incidences of those minority groups taking salary sacrifices or volunteering to go onto furlough in an effort really to try and find some way to retain their jobs, or to provide some contribution to the company that allows them to remain a part of it. The consequence of that, as I say, is when does that situation get corrected? And actually, when does that situation get corrected and we're back on the train towards equality and equity? And then creative access, you may know of them. They're a social enterprise, mainly focused on diverse recruitment and inclusion. I think they surveyed 200 or so young people that were looking to enter the creative industries earlier on in the year, since the start of the pandemic, and they found that I think 85% of the trainee entry-level like internship schemes had been discontinued, which is a substantial amount of young people looking for their first opportunity to break into the industries, which, to the point where they're on, is tied to their economic levers for social mobility, being deprived of that chance. And of those that were in work that they surveyed, 40% of those respondents had been furloughed or made redundant, I think, or had their work cancelled and postponed. So then we have a situation of young people also being deprived of the opportunity for social mobility. And when you have that situation with young people, then it's further exacerbated with gender or ethnicity. You almost have, from the very beginning of people entering their career in the industry, that there's already almost unbridgeable inequity that's only going to expand as the situation goes on.
No, absolutely. And you said at the start there, Ete, that you were talking, very much about your industry and understanding, but it's consistent, definitely. I read a data point 3 or 4 weeks ago that showed that nearly 75% of all internships have been stopped across financial, media, and many of the graduate programs that would be due to start this September as well had either been postponed or cancelled entirely. So and we know from what the data has shown that the pandemic is going to have a disproportionate impact on those that are 18 to 25. And as you say, it's going to further the inequities for those that are of different ethnicities, across gender, across disabilities as well. There is a lot around, again, before the pandemic, of showing around kind of inequalities of those that experience that have both physical and mental disabilities, and that's further within this. And I also think as well, it's my follow-on question for you, Ete, as a CEO and as a senior leader is, and I've had many conversations with senior leaders in the past few months on this topic, is the moral compass of, as you're saying, your business needs to survive, and you need to be able to ensure that you can pay your workforce and you're bringing in enough revenue to make sure that your business exists in 12 or 18 months' time. And we obviously have had government job retention schemes, and I know that there's a lot of fear, isn't there, for across all industries of what happens when those end in the next month or so. But in your role as a senior leader, because I often think you have to be very intentional when we're thinking about things around gender ethnic equality.
Yeah.
And when you're faced with making very short-term decisions, how do you make sure that you're still continuing to be very, very intentional about trying to change the inequalities that exist in the workplace?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to the fact that the truth is that a profitable, particularly in our sector, a profitable business and a high-performing business has equality and inclusivity at its core. You know, those things aren't mutually exclusive and are actually key to driving growth, particularly now. So from a creative industries point of view, particularly in advertising and marketing, you know, we know that diversity of people and experience and thought helps lead to better, more effective campaigns and work, which ultimately helps clients, which will drive your growth and revenue. We know that having a more representative workforce means that you can create work which more authentically resonates with communities and audiences, which, you know, ultimately the brand that you work with is always looking for a way to connect with either new or existing audiences in a more you know, robust and intimate and authentic way. And you can only do that if you're representative as a workforce. So I think from a strategic point of view, the two things have to coexist.
Yes.
I don't think it's a playoff between operations and inclusivity. They work together for businesses that are successful. You know, that being said, when you look at the operational model and you need to, you know, manage your costs, which are, you know, I admit a responsible business in this particular climate needs to do, you need to make sure that the decisions that you are making are made without bias. So it's looking at the criteria by which you've assessed people's ability to do the jobs, ultimately by why your organization needs to have a certain level of representation to be able to effectively do the work it needs to do for clients. I think all that, like how you've sort of developed and recognized people who are key contributors to your business versus, you know, those that you perceive as not being. And so I think making sure that when you make those decisions, you're sort of removing bias from the process. And then the truth is that equality, inclusivity, representation go hand in hand with a, you know, high performing and operationally successful business, and marrying the two things together.
Absolutely, Ete, and I think if all leaders really thought about those two things as being, as you say, mutually exclusive, and if you're looking at your operational model, you're also looking at your things around your culture and your inclusion, your productivity as part of that overall decision. And again, it's, I think it's really important of being quite intentional around that. And as you're saying, mitigating bias throughout that process. And I also think being, as a leadership team, being quite intentional and aware of the inequalities. I think that's as well. Sometimes people talk of that as being positive discrimination, and I absolutely don't see that as being positive discrimination when you're recognizing the inequalities that do exist at a society level and therefore are going to be representative in the workplace, of being very aware of that and having dialogue and conversations as you're reviewing the operational model. I think the two have to happen in hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, because there will be a recovery at some point. It may be more protracted than we think, or we might, you know, potentially sooner. But we, you know, in theory, we're hopefully on the road to recovery. And I think for a lot of businesses who have had to go through challenging times recently and maybe had struggled with reconciling some of the inequality and the diversity and inclusivity challenges they have in their business, now is the time to, you know, build back better, so to speak. We all keep talking about this incident being, or the pandemic being, a great reset for people on a personal level, on a society level, but it's also a chance for businesses to reset. And if we're all starting from the blank slate, I genuinely believe the businesses that are going to perform better are the ones who go, well, now that we're rebuilding, why don't we rebuild with the right things baked in? Why don't we rebuild and remove the bias rather than just rebuild in the way that we were before? Because the way the world was before is never
women, and we talked a little bit about it in the context of the pandemic, but more broadly, why are they greater for women? What do you
well, I mean, it's the data and my own sort of anecdotal observational experiences that unfortunately the issues are greater. The predominant one, talking before around the economic levers and leverage that people have to improve their quality of life. Nationally, we still haven't really closed the gender pay gap significantly. So that's immediately putting people at a disadvantage towards social mobility from a gender point of view. We spoke earlier on about, particularly during the pandemic, women unfortunately having to deal with a disproportionate amount of childcare and still maintain their current working practices. And I read an article in the Guardian where they're interviewing the head of the CMI and their survey, and the managers, I think it's like nearly 50% of managers actually believe that childcare caused by the coronavirus pandemic will have a negative impact on their female employees in terms of how they perceive them being able to manage and do work. And so if that's the perception of managers, you can only imagine that perception will then go on to colour the progression and the opportunities that are given unfairly to men versus women without trying to resolve some of the root cause and systemic challenges around the unequal distribution of work potentially at home, or not allowing flexibility in the workplace and moving to cultures which are much more around performance and what people do as members of the team against clear objectives rather than the presenteeism of clocking in on 9 to 5 and being in the office and having to work a 37-hour week on Monday to Friday. I think we need to move to a world that allows them a lot more flexibility, a lot more individual ownership and accountability, but then allows people to be truly productive, self-motivated. For me, the sort of the tail effect of the risk we run around both the pandemic, but also the pre-existing systemic inequality we have, the lack of women in senior leadership roles, particularly in our industry. Not only that points to the bias of progression in career development, but it becomes a sort of challenging, self-perpetuating system whereby if the senior roles normally will come with higher salaries, which allow people to again the economic lever towards social mobility, but without the representation, you don't any other minority, and they aren't brought into industries and organizations that are set up for them to thrive, that are sort of intuitive to the experiences and the challenges that they will have. And so then it just becomes this, it could become this unfortunate cycle, both within an organization, but we have to start to think about the effect that organizations, be it in the corporate private sector, but the effect that they have on the wider society and community through not just opportunities and access to jobs, but the story we tell people about progression, from the very early ages of being in school and to what's portrayed in the media.
No, absolutely. And you touched, I can see Dina asked a question that's very similar to my next one around role models. move on to that question, just wanted to pick up on something that you were talking about in terms of the inequalities for men and women. And as you're saying, the gender pay gap, when you add to that intersectionality, and when we start to look at the gender pay gap for non-white women, the data and organisations, unfortunately, don't have to publish that data at the moment, but we know what that data is going to show. And for those organisations that have started to publish it ahead of them having to do so, it is showing that there's further inequities. And there are many really fantastic activist campaigners in this space are focusing on the issues across intersectionality around gender equality. But also, one of the other things, as we were talking about in terms of what's the optimum working environment and working from home, and very early on in the pandemic, I mean, Flex Appeal, that does loads of great work in this space, was saying measuring the productivity of a woman at the moment isn't reflective of her normal productivity, because of, again, women, not all women, but some women having to do the homeschooling, still having to do lots of things and still trying to do a full work. What we've been campaigning for and encouraging is organisations to allow more flexibility, but equally can't be measuring people on being their most flexible at the time of a pandemic, when there are so many other factors into us adjusting to working life. And again, I think that's an important thing where the organisations need to take into account when they're looking at the operational models and making decisions about people. What are the other factors that are going on? Someone that may be at home on their own versus someone that's having to care for an elderly person, having to look after their children. The productivities are different, and the measures are different, and I think that's as well. And it's hard, it's not an easy thing for an organisation to do, but those things need to be looked at if we're ever going to start to close these gaps and start to allow more movement for a broader population across the UK and other countries.
Yeah, and I think commercially competitive is because survive on talent. And I was operating your point as productive as they can be, circumstances, however they face themselves. And I think we've been talking about it quite a lot within our business, in that the measures for productivity and effectiveness of an individual, I do think need looking at. Like, we have a lot of legacy measures in many sectors where, on a very basic level, it is around the presenteeism, people showing up and working certain hours. On others, it's about, utilization against like timesheets of the hours of time that people have clocked against a certain job that they've been working in. But the real holy grail you need to get to around productivity is around output and value. And we're trying to find that at the moment, trying to find ways that you can actually measure that in a more effective way, because that is critically what you pay people skills to do. It's their output and their value. And the unfortunate truth is, it's pretty arbitrary to assume that is tied to the amount of hours that they've clocked on a timesheet or the amount of hours they've worked in a week.
Yeah,
that's not the case.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And how many of us have had conversations, both probably personally and professionally, particularly that are not exclusively to parents, but just as you navigate, as you work in different environments, the ones that you thrive in are the ones where you're given really high levels of trust. So you don't need to say when you have a doctor's appointment, you don't need to say when you're going to watch your children's play, or whether you're going to see an elderly relative. All of those things, you're adult enough to make the decisions. And as soon as you start to get those really high levels of of trust. That's when you get the most out of people. And there's so much psychology as well around when we're at our most productive and when we're at our most efficient. If I just make the comparison with my husband, I get up early, I work, those first 3 hours of my day are my most productive, generally when no one else is around in the house or up, whereas he's entirely the opposite. And again, this notion of 9 to 6, and that's when we need contact with people, but allowing people to make the decision of, I'm going to work really early and I finish at 1, and then I go off and do a load of sport, I go and do something in the afternoon. But it's not just about people being parents, it's about people being people and making those decisions and knowing it's the connection between our mental, our physical well-being, all of these things coming into play that allows people to be their most productive.
I agree with you 100%, and allowing them, you have so much. I've sat in so many businesses where the talk is always around culture and how do you sort of make people feel motivated and feel like the cause and the business's mission is their mission, as much as it is, for other things that they do in their sort of personal lives. And for me, it always kind of comes back to respect and trust and empowerment. Like that's like, as you say, we manage our own day-to-day lives the best way that works for us. And I think we need to respect the people that we've hired as talented professional individuals to do the right thing in the interest of the business. So trust them to do that, respect them to know how best capable to provide the best output for you at the time that works for them, with an understanding of what's needed from the business, and then empower them to do it, and like actually give people that respect, trust, and empowerment. And I've just started reading Reed Hastings' book, the CEO of Netflix, Rules, No Rules. And I disagree with some of it. I'm not entirely sure I enjoy taking his, I agree with his stance on returning to the office. But what I do agree with is that a lot of the rules we have around the workplace and behavior and operations and productivity are all out of the post-war factory era. And they need to be reevaluated because it's a very different world that we work in now. And, his philosophy around high-performing, agile businesses that are able to respond to uncertainty, it's a lot more around how you enable, equip, and trust good people to be part of your organization, rather than the sort of the factory view, which I've always felt, and this isn't a disparaging for anyone that works on factory, but that punch in, punch out mentality ultimately just doesn't place trust in individuals, that people actually want to come to work to do a good job. And if you're part of a team, you know that you have a role for your team members. And I think we should give people a bit more trust and respect that that's what we do, and actually see the positives of people, rather than assume most workers are work shy and looking for ways to cheat a company, because they're not. The majority of people I've worked with, I've managed and led, are not. They're the opposite, if anything.
No, absolutely. And as you said earlier, if you're measuring on output and value, then none of those things matter when they're doing that work. If their output and the quality of the output and the value that they're bringing, then those things shouldn't be as important. And I think particularly across sectors such as the creative industries, media, because there are lots of industries where this model can work. Yes, I've also heard the argument, if you're in a restaurant, if you're in some of the service industries, some of these things that we're talking about are less applicable, but equally that thing around measuring on outputs and changing that narrative, I still think it's relevant.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, just to interrupt you, because I understand the points around, you said, the service industry. I think it's a very interesting sort of philosophical point around that point of empowering people around output and control at work. And Disney, great brands, but a very high performing business for a lot of reasons. And they have that famous philosophy which sort of exists in law. Every employee in Disneyland is given the empowerment to make that day special for their customers or for a child or for whatever else, so they can do whatever's within their power to do it. And I know they'll probably have rules around working hours and whatever else, but like, you have to give people a certain amount of flexibility within their roles to be the best that they can be, and you can do that within constraints. You can, but it's important not to lose sight of that if you want to get the best out of motivated people.
No, yeah, absolutely. And Ete, the importance of role models, particularly when we're talking about representation. So whether that's around gender representation, representation of Black men, women in senior leadership, disabilities, whatever it is that we're talking about, it's really important in the area of equality. And for you, Ete, as a senior leader, what role do you think that plays in terms of having those role models and those people in those senior positions? And what small steps could organisations take in terms of making sure that people have access to role models and allies within their businesses?
Well, I mean, I think the sort of the role of role models is critical, and that representation is important. It's from my own personal experience, but a lot of the work we do with Culture Heroes and We Are Stripes, people's decisions around choosing a company, going into an industry, are very much governed by how they see the experience and the success of others within that company, industry, sector, both consciously and unconsciously. Because if you have somebody who is reflective of yourself making it to a certain journey, then you know that that's a place where there's potentially a home for you. That's a place where there's opportunity for you to grow and to be developed and feel valued. Where that representation is a little bit less, and we as human beings, we are imprinted. Everything that we follow is an example of things that we see before, and that happens from us from the day that we're born, pretty much, and it is just cemented as we go through life, particularly in our careers and in education. And that's where representation plays a key role in that imprinting, is actually seeing people that have trodden the path that you want to follow, that are similar to yourself, that can talk from your life experience and give you that support and that navigation, but also set the example that you can choose to follow.
Absolutely. My last question, because I can see we've got a few really great questions from the audience as well. We always talk in Diverse Company, and it's something I'm really passionate about, people taking individual responsibility. So yes, society, corporations, government has a responsibility, but what one piece of advice would you give for an individual in terms of trying to help sociability movement of others?
Yeah, it's I sort of, as you said, the some of the challenges are systemic, but as individuals and as people, we do play a role in sort of upholding, supporting, reinforcing some of the challenges in the system. The sort of main bit of advice I think everybody can do is a bit of self-education and acknowledgement around the challenges around social mobility, and seeing what within your own sphere of influence you can do to try and readdress that inequity and inequality. But it comes from trying to really understand the problems. A lot of people, I think, are still a little bit ignorant or blind or not convinced that other people from a certain lower economic society group face inherent barriers that mean that there's sort of intergenerational challenges to them being successful. And that's what I would encourage people to try and do, to sort of get more awareness, which then hopefully lead to action. In particular for the leaders, I would say, who joining or CEOs in my position, is that the personal action I think you can take is try to push for that performance over presenteeism culture in your business. Like, because then that underpins your philosophy and strategy around remote working, around support for carers, around accessing talent that can't make it into the cities, that might be from underprivileged areas or other parts of the UK whereby there's the economies maybe aren't as strong, but once you have that performance over presenteeism, you are allowing yourself access and opportunity to brilliant talent all around the country from wherever walks of life they come from, which ultimately is a benefit to your business. So as leaders and CEOs, I would say take that action and build your strategies around that. As individuals, I'd say spend time understanding the challenges around socio-economic mobility or social mobility, and then from that, just build your own personal commitment as to what you can do within your sphere of influence to make any small change that you can do.
Yeah. And I think often we try to do things and think about the big strategies, but so often the impact of us all making a small change and the cumulative impact that has. But I think that's really fantastic advice, particularly for leaders, and I would absolutely agree that focus on performance and outputs over presenteeism. We have lots of conversations around this with our clients in India, and it's, I think, even more so there. And a number of my colleagues were sharing with me when they've worked for other organisations, they'd even been sat there with no work to do, but they wouldn't leave the office because it would be seen as negative. So people would just be sitting effectively idle of not doing anything because of that culture around presenteeism. So, Ete, I can see we've got some questions. The first question we've got from Claire: whose responsibility is it to work to solve issues around social mobility?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the obviously the immediate answer is that the real change, and particularly sort of policy change and some of the systemic change, has to be led by government and people in positions of influence society. But actually, I think it's everyone's. Going back to our point, we are all part of that systemic challenge and some of those systemic issues, even if we unconsciously contribute to them or hold them in whatever way. So there is a shared responsibility, I think, as a society to address those issues and lobby those who can actually make policy change or can create the sort of economic levers or wealth redistribution that helps with social mobility, but that we're all responsible and I think accountable to that. And corporate organizations, very much so. There's a lot we can do around how we, talking before around distributed workforces, how that then has an effect on local communities. If people are able to, work in more rural environments, or they're able to work within their own local communities, they are then redistributing their salaries, their sort of economic benefits back into the local communities, which then also has a wider effect on that community. So I think it's collective.
I would definitely agree there. Next question from Kate.
One of the key things I think is, you have to just really look at the makeup of your organization, and when you're looking at culturally, just be very mindful of in-group and out-group bias. If people from socio-economically challenged backgrounds are atypical, then it's more than likely they're going to be in the out-group, and there may be small things and just tiny little behaviors such as everyone going out to the pub or a restaurant at lunchtime. If you are from a slightly more challenged situation, you can't afford to do that every Friday. it's tiny things like that you might need to be sort of conscious of, to more kind of expansive things, that making sure that, you know, people aren't penalized, as you mentioned before, for not being able to get transport into work. You know, that they're able to work remotely if they can't afford the train or the season ticket, or the bus journeys particularly long that mean their hours need to be flexible. But I think it starts with looking at the makeup of your organization, being, you know, trying to use whatever data and talk to people, ultimately, and insight you can, to understand whether you have in-group, out-group biases, and what other prejudicial things you may have, either culturally or systemically within the business, that you can change really to make it more inclusive.
Thanks, Ete. I agree with all those points there. I'm going to jump to the next question from David. Do you think the pandemic will have any positive effects on organisations trusting staff from when working from home?
I mean, I think it's forced the organisations to take the lead. And yes, we've had an economic hit, which is kind of inevitable, but there are still lots of organisations and companies that have made it through it, that have not necessarily fallen over, and the Pandora's box is open now. You know, we had to have people working remotely for 7 months. We found ways to work through that, many companies found ways to be productive and to be resilient. And that comes down to the trust that you placed in people in your organizations to do a good job. So I think it will have a positive effect. I think one of the things that I hope stays, and I'm very grateful of, is that, you know, I, for a long time, been talking in the industry around, particularly when it comes to gender equality, sort of flexibility and remote working for people who are, you know, carers, be they parents or what have you. And the big challenge you often have in creative industries is, oh, but we need everybody to be here, and it's just not the same working remotely. And, you know, I've always said, well, if it was business critical, you would find a way for it to work. Yeah. The last 7 months, you know, I hate to say, I unfortunately proved right. And you know, there were businesses who said that they couldn't give one person a day of flexible working. So, you know, 1,000 people businesses that overnight were able to do that for their employees. There is no way they can go back on that now. So hopefully we see everybody moving forward, and, you know, placing more trust in people. And trust is reciprocal. You know, if you place trust in an organization, people are more committed. And if you're worried that the employees that you have will abuse that trust genuinely, then I think you need to look at the values you have in an organization and that you perpetuate, and how you're hiring people. But also, our first-hand experience in Engine is that when you go into that situation, people that are abusing the trust of the system and letting the team down are exposed pretty instantly. Like, you can see it, you know, so a lot more than when people were in the office. So I'm all for it, and I think the competitive future-facing organizations will be embracing it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I had another client say exactly. She said, before it was often leaders that were addressing performance issues, now it's employees. And I think it's because things are so much more transparent with the way that we're working when someone isn't performing or someone isn't doing that. So yeah, I absolutely agree. And I was just smiling as you were talking there, Ete, kind of business critical, how quickly, you know, multinational organizations, and we all did, didn't we, were able to make sure that everyone had the equipment to be able to work from home. So we have to use it as a positive, I think. I'm conscious of time, Ete, so I'll just pick I think we've covered a few points from some of the questions. I think we talked a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing that's good around social mobility. But I was going to just pick on Dina's question of, should organisations make tracking, understanding social mobility a must-do rather than a nice-to-have? And I just add to this, because I think it's often one of the areas of diversity and inclusion that isn't talked about because it's often invisible. There's a Rachel Lord, who's the MD of BlackRock, talks about it. She grew up from a council estate in northeast East London, and she said no one knows that because it's not visible. It's not visible like my gender is visible. So yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this one, Ete.
Yeah, I do, and I'll go back to the rationale is that it is all about access to great talent, and not as an organization, not shutting yourself off to people who can be additive to the success and growth and performance of your company, and making sure that you've created the environment for them to be successful. And in order to make sure you're not shut off that access to talent, you need to reach people from like all streams of social strata, and particularly looking at social mobility, which you might have neglected before, and make sure that those people are able to be successful, that the environment is inclusive to them. So then that means that tracking and understanding that social mobility data in order to have access to that talent and to sustain that talent is a must do. Of course, the challenge is how you measure that criterion and data. But I just think organizations need to start and realize that as they start, just start somewhere, whether it's measuring education or whatever else, and refine that data as you go along, but not having clarity on how you would actually accurately define it is not a reason to not get started. So I think it's a must do. I think people need to just get started and realize that you will learn more and be able to refine that as you go along. That's the whole process you go through with building an inclusive organization. It's not a one-shot situation. It's continual, but it delivers continual value if you're focused and committed to it.
Yeah, absolutely, Ete, and I think I definitely agree with the point there of start somewhere. We never have the perfect answer on whatever it is that we're doing, and I think it is so important that we're starting to collect more data and understand more on this topic. And I think it's, as you say, it's a commercial imperative and an interest to organisations to do this, because it will give you a broader range of access to talent across the UK, specifically for the UK, across whatever market, but also then thinking about globally as well. Ete, thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and we've had some fantastic questions, and I really appreciate you spending the time to talk to me about the topic of social mobility. I took one thing away as well from the start, that there has to be something in terms of how we can change the way the language we use and the definition. And I think even just the wording, there's something in can we change the wording so it's more inclusive when we're talking about it.